Rohan, thank you for being with us this morning on an important day for OPEC and its allies. Before we come on to the meeting today, I'd just love to get your take on the recent volatility we've seen in the price of oil. It's seesawed pretty significantly, moving sharply in both directions this morning, recouping some of its losses, but it's been a tough ride for oil recently.
The market is certainly taking a wait and see approach with the Omicron variant. I think, like the Delta variant, there's a lot of risk involved, especially if there are closures and lockdowns. Certainly at this moment, a lot of regulators are advising us that it's not as potent as the Delta variant. And so maybe some of the risks aren't as bad as they are with the Delta variant. So right now we've seen vaccination programs rolled out and a lot of positive news coming out on the demand side, which is why you've seen some of that seesaw action. But even though it hasn't recovered all of the losses from last week with some of the news around the spreading in certain continents of the variant, right now this is something that investors certainly should be looking out for, because if demand were to start falling over the next couple months or even the next few weeks, that could certainly change OPEC's output guidelines that they put forth.
So coming on to today's meeting and bearing all of that in mind, all of the uncertainty from the Omicron variant, what are you expecting out of the alliance?
I think the most likely outcome is they're just going to stick with their current guidelines, which is raise production by about 400,000 barrels a month, which is something they've planned out for a number of months now. Juliana, we spoke a couple months ago about why they weren't being a bit more aggressive with some of their production increases when prices were hitting $70, $80 a barrel. And I think they were looking at the risk of something like this with a variant that could spread or any kind of COVID-19 outbreak that would affect the market. So certainly they've been a lot more conservative with their guidelines and some of the approaches that they've taken. Also, a couple of wild cards to keep in mind. I don't think this will affect their policies or what they do at today's meeting, but the strategic petroleum reserve releases of about 50 million barrels from the U.S., that's something to keep in mind. And then also the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks. And if those go a little bit more positively, that could release another million barrels into the market. I don't think that's going to change what OPEC does here, but those are two things to keep in mind.
Well, Rohan, what was your take on the move from the Biden administration to go ahead and release reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
It's certainly, if anything, just a very short-lived impact on the market. 50 million barrels is really not a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, especially when you factor in global demand. I think it was much more of a political move just to kind of lower fuel prices, which we've seen in most of the developed markets, and most notably in Europe, have really been spiking up a lot. Infrastructure shortages are part of that, but the Biden administration and even other countries like the UK have released reserves in order to combat some of those price increases to some extent. But really, it's going to fall on other alliances like OPEC and other producers like major U.S. shale producers to kind of change the spectrum on that thing.